February 23rd, 1981, interview with Dr. Carson Bennett. Before we start, could you give me a brief background of how you came to Ball State?
Okay, I'm originally from Michigan. I went to school in Western Michigan and completed my undergraduate degree there and did my master's degree and PhD degree at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And the year that I was finishing up at the University of Michigan, I was looking for a college teaching job. And this was one of the college teaching jobs that was open. And so I took it and I came to teach here in the fall of 1955. I've been here since.
Okay. When did you, since you came here in 1955, when did you first notice that the peace movement was picking up speed at Ball State?
My first awareness of it would have been sometime, and this is awfully general, would have been sometime in the 60s. And I just don't have a good memory for dates at all. It would have been middle 60s sometime, I guess.
Mm-hmm. How did the administration react to the students' participation?
Well, I think you have to look at that, the administration reaction in the context of the whole Ball State student body's involvement or lack of involvement in activism of any kind. And I would say that what happened at Ball State was that Ball State student body got involved in activism late in the game in general, and that these things tended to happen on the West Coast, and they kind of drifted to the Midwest, and that even in terms of Midwest schools, the Ball State student body's reaction in any kind of organized way was late in the game, and that while there was some student activism at Ball State, and there was an underground newspaper called The Only Alternative, which published a number of articles very critical of administration, that in the context of the whole national student movement, Ball State's student involvement was very limited, even at its height. And so I don't think there was much of a response from the administration. I don't think there was any attempt on the part of the administration to restrain students in any way, or even more extremely to punish them for their activity. Because I think that even at its height, the level of activism was pretty limited. Does that answer your question? Okay.
In what ways did you become associated with the movement, if any?
In a couple of ways. I was actively involved at that point in time in community affairs in the 60s in a couple of ways. One in individual rights issues, particularly with teachers and students in the public schools. And through those kinds of activities, partly through those and partly through another kind of involvement, I was involved with a community issue that involved the building of Northside High School. And because of my involvement, and I was also involved to some extent in women's rights activities, because of my involvement in all those things, I met a number of people who were in the peace movement, because the same kind of people. It tends to be the same group of people who are involved in the peace movement, who are involved in civil rights issues, things of that kind. And so I think that that's how I became involved. The only peace activity that per se that I remember participating in was the march that faculty and students had calling for a moratorium in Vietnam, and we marched from campus to downtown, and it was a relatively uneventful march. There were a fair number of people who participated, and there were only two things. Hi, Rose.
Hello, you creep. Okay, we were talking about the march downtown.
Oh, there were only a couple of things that I remember about it particularly. One is that we marched down Riverside, and there were a great many people who were out on the lawns, particularly around the fraternity houses on Riverside, who were yelling some things. And I don't think that there was any incident involved throwing anything, or at least throwing anything that was dangerous. The other thing I remember is that the Muncie police were there, as they should have been, to make sure that the march was orderly, but they were taking pictures. And I think the thing that a number of us assumed was that those pictures probably ended up in a number of files. You know, if the people who were marching were activists, there probably was a file somewhere in the FBI or CIA, God knows where, and probably those pictures were developed and cropped and put in there, I would guess.
Do you have any reason to believe that there was a lot of FBI or CIA activity on campus?
No, I really don't. And if there was, I wasn't aware of it, and I don't even remember talking to anybody who was aware. There were rumors kicking around that that the FBI had hired one of the detective agencies, I'm tempted to say Burns detective agencies, and that they were having some of their operatives register as students to see what was going on. Now that was going on, at least it was rumored to be going on on campuses at that point in time, but by personal knowledge, I don't ever know a situation where an FBI representative was, or person was registered in a class for purposes of observation. We assumed, with regard to the pictures, that that's probably where those would end up, but again, we don't know.
How did the community react to the student-faculty march?
I think the community response was pretty limited. As I remember, there was a small story carried about it in the newspaper. I don't remember that there was any media coverage or any TV coverage of it. But again, I think that the reason for the lack of very much community response to the peace activities was that they were pretty limited, and they never were all that dramatic or all that disruptive. And so I think the community people tended to look at it within the context of these are the kinds of things that college kids do. It's well within the range of normally expected behavior from college students. It's not a cause for concern. Maybe I'm overplaying that, but it seemed to me that the response of the administration and community, understandably, was pretty limited because of the fact that it was a small movement at best, a limited number of students involved, limited number of activities. I remember, and I didn't witness it, a furor, and you probably talked about this with some other people, involving the threatened execution or burning of a dog on the steps of the Admiral. You read of that story? Mm-hmm. And I've forgotten all the details of it, but there was a pretty big response to that. But again, it seems to me that the administration response, I don't think they forbid the students doing it. I think probably they were police there to make sure that they, and I don't know what they would have done to that. They didn't come off. They threatened, as I remember, to do something, and then they really didn't. Mm-hmm. Okay?
About the time, right after the Kent State incident, there were a number of rallies on the Arts Terrace. Can you tell me a little about that?
I just remember that they occurred. I didn't have, I may have attended some, I wasn't involved in them. I remember talking with students in classes about Kent State, and got a very mixed student reaction. I would say that the dominant reaction I got from the undergraduate students I talked with was one that was fairly unsympathetic to the Kent State students. A fairly conservative kind of reaction, which in effect said, well, the students wouldn't have gotten in trouble if they hadn't been doing this, and if they hadn't been at least verging on engaging in unlawful behaviors, and they were not able to deal with it in the context of the real meaning of what the students were trying to do, and in the context of the terrible overreaction that the students got. Reaction was very much like, I don't remember you've heard about the Detroit housewife, Lana Luosa, who went to Selma, Alabama, to participate in one of the integration marches, and I think, was arrested. Anyway, got into trouble, and maybe it became some kind of physical harm. I don't think she was killed. But people's reaction to that, a very typical reaction around here was that she didn't have any business being there. And I got more of that kind of reaction. I got a few students who were sympathetic with it, but that was a minority reaction.
Do you remember Ball State sponsoring the Vietnam Moratorium Day as anything other than the march itself?
No, I'm not being very helpful to you, and I'm sorry, because as I told you on the phone, my involvement with the peace movement was very limited, much more limited than with the civil rights kinds of things in a more general way. But all I really remember about that is the march. I don't remember the rest of that day's activities very well at all.
Do you remember very many teach-ins on campus?
There were some, and there was an attempt to get some organized, but I wouldn't have any sense now now you talk about teach-ins in terms of occurring in the classroom, or teach-ins occurring in terms of public meetings?
Public meetings.
I don't honestly remember that. I remember that there were a couple of occasions when there was an agreement when faculty were encouraged to talk about war and peace issues in their classes, and that some of us did.
Did you?
I did on a couple of, I remember on a particular day, 2 or 3 classes, and we were talking really about the basis for the objection to this war, and the whole issue of whether people had a right to object to war in general, whether they had a right to object to this particular war. And the theme of what I tried to present to students was that it seemed to me that what was important historically about the Vietnam protest activities was that it represented one of the first really unpopular wars in this country that I recall having been drafted and serving in World War II, and having talked with older people, that it seemed to me that the response of young people to wars previously had been either to volunteer and go, or to fairly to accept pretty much the idea they were going to be drafted and participate, and that it didn't occur to people to question the legitimacy of involvement in a particular war.
How did the students react to your spending class time talking about that?
There was no objection, really, because it was limited. I got no objections to it. I don't know if other people did or not. I got no objections ever from administration for having done it.
There had been a couple instances, like Beeman Hall, for one, in '69, sent Nixon a letter saying that they supported him, and there were telegrams sent to Nixon. Do you remember very much about pro-war involvement among students?
No, I really don't. As I say, it seemed to me that and I don't think this is unfair, but it seemed to me that a majority of the students really weren't on either side. They were not allowed to do the point of view that they were not at any particular more in the point of view of being willing to hear both points of view. There was a relatively small group that was involved in protest activities in the peace movement, and I would guess that it would have been an even smaller group that would have been involved in the pro-war activities.
Do you ever remember any instances where violence occurred as a result of, say, people being involved in either one, the peace movement, or being pro?
No, I'm not aware, and it may have occurred, but in terms of my awareness, I'm not aware of anything more than something verbal, somebody yelling something uncomplimentary at someone, or some kind of verbal argument about positions. Were there some cases where during that time where there was violence?
There had been instances of where students forced, physically held students back from entering class, like on one of the strikes that Ball State had. People have recalled that they've seen people being held physically back from entering the buildings.
No, I didn't see any of that. I wasn't aware of it. And as a matter of fact, I think that on that particular day that you're talking about, I think that may have been one of the days when they talked about war and peace in class for the students who came. And I don't even have an impression about what proportion of students participated in that. I'm not being very helpful to you, but I'll do the best I can.
Do you remember the May Day March on Washington, D.C.?
Only that it occurred. Didn't participate in it. I only remember that it occurred. And I only remember the concern that some of us had about some students being arrested and about whether they were going to be given due process. And that my feeling about it at the time, I think I'm feeling a lot of us who were involved in civil liberties, was that there was too strong a police response to it, and that there were not only were cases where people were kept in jail without due process having been observed.
Were there any preparations made at Ball State to ensure that the students, would be provided with bail money, or?
And if you're asking, were there faculty members who worked with students or students group, I think students talked about this possibility. I'm not aware that there were any elaborate preparations made for this. I'm not aware of any.
So the people just took off for Washington and took what may come?
That's my impression, pretty much, yeah.
Okay. Do you remember any of the tear gassing incidents that occurred on campus?
No.
Okay.
Were there some? Where?
At Cooper.
At Cooper,
on 71.
Okay. Well, that's amazing. Something that recent I wouldn't remember it. I just know. Okay. I'd be making up if I told you I did.
Do you remember anything about Nixon's anti-inaugural ball that was held on the Arts Terrace?
No.
Okay.
I told you my involvement with the peace movement was very limited. I was pretty actively involved with some other movements that time. And I was sympathetic to the peace movement, but I really wasn't involved.
Do you have any other recollections of the movement or any other comments?
Well, I'm convinced that, I wish that I had been involved more than I was, and I'm not sure quite of all the reasons why I wasn't involved to a greater extent than I was, because it seems to me that it was a terribly important movement, that I would argue that it was in fact the anti-war protests, which were basically on college campuses that led to Lyndon Johnson deciding not to run for president again, and led ultimately to the end of the Vietnam War. I think it was a terribly important movement.
Do you think that it had very much an impact on Ball State then?
Not sure I understand in what sense, what is you're asking.
Do you think that the movement itself had any significance to students at Ball State then?
I think it had significance for the small number. I'm sure that for the small number of students who were involved, that it was had a great deal of impact on them. In the way I think that involvement in any successful or semi-successful protest activity has an impact on people. I think the faculty and students who are involved in any of these activities, where they could see some kind of effects of what they were doing, I think that has a very significant effect, because I think it would very likely lead to some kind of long-term commitment to activities of that kind.
Well then, in that sense, do you think it was very successful at Ball State?
Yeah, I think it was successful at Ball State, because I think that anytime you look at protest activities at Ball State, you have to look within the context of the fact that this is the Midwest, that it's the heartland, that it's conservative, and that in demographic terms, our student body tends to be a upper lower class group or lower middle class group. And if you look at places where there have been large protest movements by students, it's been where there have been a substantial upper middle class students. Those tend to be the students who because of the kinds of experiences they have, the kind of values in the homes, those tend to be the students who participate more. So I think given the nature of our student body and our geographic location and the social milieu in which Fall State was operating at that point in time, I think that you could argue that it was kind of amazing that there was as much involvement as there was, and that what there was an important kind of thing. I wasn't being critical when I said earlier about the fact you had to look at to administrative and community reactions in terms of the context of it being a limited kind of thing. But I think that was there. I think if there had been, 20% or 30% or 40% of the students involved, I think you would have gotten a kind of much more of an administrative response to it. I think there were conversations among the administration, I'm aware that there were, about what they were going to do if more widespread and more active student protests developed.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other comments you'd like to?
No.
Okay, would you like to conclude this then?
Yeah, that'd be fine. I hope this is helpful.